The fiancé of the children's author Helen Bailey is found guilty of her murder. Ian Stewart killed the writer at their home last year, dumping her body in a cesspit in the hope of inheriting millions of pounds. We'll have the latest from St Albans Crown Court, also this lunchtime. The Supreme Court says income rules which prevent some people bringing a foreign spouse to the UK are lawful. The British IS fighter who carried out a suicide bombing has been described as an enemy of the state by a former government reviewer of terrorism. The BBC is to create a new television channel for Scotland. It'll have a £30 million budget and begin broadcasting next year. A convicted murderer is on the run after armed men helped him escape during a hospital visit in Liverpool. And fit for a princess, many of Princess Diana's most beautiful and famous dresses go on public display.
In the south, Portsmouth at a standstill again after another unexploded wartime bomb is dredged up from the harbour. And parents' anger. Their Berkshire preschool is forced to close after being evicted by the local church.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. The fiancé of the children's author Helen Bailey has been found guilty of murdering her and dumping her body in a cesspit under their home in Hertfordshire. Ian Stewart, who's 56, drugged Miss Bailey over a period of several months before smothering her in April last year in the hope of claiming a multi-million-pound inheritance. Detectives are now re-examining the death of Stewart's previous partner, his wife Diane, who died suddenly in 2010. Our Home Affairs correspondent, June Kelly, is at St Albans Crown Court.
Well, Jane, Helen Bailey's nickname for Ian Stewart was the gorgeous, grey-haired widower. In court, he was described as a devious killer and a full-blown liar. Within hours of killing Helen Bailey, he was siphoning thousands from her bank account. A couple of months later, he went on holiday to Spain. And it was a few weeks after he got back from holiday that there was an early morning knock on his door from the police. Police recorded Ian Stewart's arrest at his home.
I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Helen Bailey. Are you joking?
He was stunned he'd finally been caught out. For 3 months he'd been living with the body of his wealthy partner buried under the garage.
Why? I don't understand.
My name's Helen Bailey and I'd like to introduce you to my new book, which is called When Bad Things Happen in Good Bikinis.
Helen Bailey was a successful author. As well as murdering her, Stewart also killed her dachshund Boris, whom she doted on.
Oh, that wasn't supposed to happen.
After her husband's death, Helen Bailey began blogging about her sense of loss. And it was through a Facebook bereavement group that she met Ian Stewart, whose wife had died. She thought she'd found a new soulmate. But while she was planning their wedding, he was planning her murder. Last spring, Helen Bailey suddenly vanished from their £1 million home in Royston in Hertfordshire. It took Ian Stewart 5 days to report her missing.
Please, how can I help?
Hello there. My partner has been missing since Monday and not contacted anyone.
Despite appeals from family and friends, there was no sign of Helen Bailey. 3 months after she disappeared, police came back here and began searching places they hadn't looked at before, including a spot in the garage. The garage was at a distance from the house. This laser imaging illustrates how underneath a hatch door there was a well with a cesspit. The police started probing, and it was here, below a layer of sewage, that they saw an arm. They had found Helen Bailey's body, and buried with her was her dog, Boris. There was even a possibility that because she'd been drugged, she could have been alive when Stewart put her down here. CCTV shows how within hours Ian Stewart drove to a rubbish tip to dump a duvet.
Was that duvet taken to the tip because it had Helen's blood on it?
In police interviews, Stewart said nothing. He probably smothered Helen Bailey after drugging her over a long period with his sleeping pills. His motive was money. He was set to benefit massively from her £4 million fortune.
If Helen had written a book of the story, you wouldn't believe it. He'd probably planned it all from the day he met her, and in hindsight, I don't think he loved her at all. But Helen definitely loved him.
This is Ian Stewart's late wife, Diane. With his criminal trial over, we can now report that the police are re-examining her sudden death, said to have been caused by an epileptic fit. At this stage, there's no indication of anything suspicious.
Well, I think it's only right that I consider what might have happened in Ian Stewart's past, to see whether there's anything that I need to get involved in, whether there's any fresh evidence that might have come out from this trial.
After his wife died, Ian Stewart was seen with other women before he began his predatory pursuit of Helen Bailey. As a writer, she was used to studying human behaviour, but she never learned the true character of the man who was closest to her and who she thought she knew best. Well, Ian Stewart was found guilty of a total of 6 charges, including fraud. And as the guilty verdicts were brought in, he shook his head. He's now facing a fresh investigation over the death of his wife, Diane. Helen Bailey has elderly parents. Her mother testified by video link in this trial, and her brother John has been in court throughout. In a statement, he said his family's thoughts were with the family of Ian Stewart. He said what Stewart had done had left them all devastated. Jane.
June Kelly, thank you. The Supreme Court has ruled that the government has the right to set a minimum wage that British citizens must earn before bringing a foreign husband or wife into the country. People affected by the rules had argued that the minimum income level, currently £18,600 a year, was unreasonably high. But the court ruled that the measures don't breach human rights legislation. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford reports.
They look like any other family. But Caroline Coombs, her husband Carlos from Ecuador, and their 15-month-old son Thomas live in a permanent state of uncertainty, not knowing whether they'll be able to stay together in Britain, because Caroline, a former television producer, is earning less than £18,000 a year, which under new immigration rules is not enough to bring a foreign husband or wife to the UK.
We were two very capable human beings who happened to fall in love. And we were being told that we'd be split up. And we had a young baby. And it was like we weren't being given the right to be a family in my own country.
The Supreme Court ruling today said that the new rules were defective, particularly when it came to children, but it found that the controversial MIR, the minimum income requirement, did not break human rights laws.
It holds that the MIR is acceptable in principle, but the rules and instructions fail to take proper account of the Section 55 duty in respect of children.
Although the government has technically lost this case in the Supreme Court on the way it implements its new rule, it is nonetheless a victory for ministers on the principle that people on low incomes can't just assume that their foreign husband or wife can automatically join them in Britain.
It is considered reasonable to expect you to leave the UK and...
But Caroline and Carlos do now have a chance because the Home Office agreed today to carefully consider what the Supreme Court had said about how the rules are unlawful because they don't pay enough attention to the best interests of children.
The system is wrong. Something needs to be changed. And only for me, for all the other kids that are out there, for all the other moms that are suffering every day, can I sleep thinking that the husband have to leave the country?
What have we got?
Many thousands of couples were affected by the new laws, which were designed to reduce the cost of immigrants claiming benefit. Families with children now have a second chance, as do couples with other sources of income. But for many, the minimum income requirement will still stop them being reunited in Britain. Daniel Sanford, BBC News, at the Supreme Court.
A former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Lord Carlisle, has said a British Islamic State fighter who carried out a suicide bombing in Iraq was an enemy of the state who should never have been paid the £1 million in compensation. And in the last hour, the former Prime Minister Tony Blair has hit out at press reports criticising his role in the matter, saying that the compensation for the Muslim convert's time in Guantanamo Bay was agreed by a Conservative-led government. We'll have more on that in a moment with Norman Smith at Westminster. But first, let's talk to our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. And this individual himself, Frank, I mean, is it embarrassing? How big an intelligence failure is it that he was able to do what he ultimately did in Iraq?
It's not as big as it might seem, because when he came out of Guantanamo Bay in 2004, he was assessed, as anybody would be who came out of there, is this person a threat to British security and, to the safety of British citizens? And is he involved in violent extremism? And the answer was no at the time. Now, he may not have changed his beliefs. He may have basically been in waiting, a terrorist in waiting, as it were. But for those 10 years between him coming out of Guantanamo Bay and going off to Syria to join so-called Islamic State, he didn't actually show his hand. So he would have been under some kind of monitoring, some kind of surveillance, not particularly heavy ones. And it may well be that he had no connections, no sympathies with extremism at that time. But just before he went off to Syria, he then started to get involved and, of course, went off and joined IS. What all of this throws into question is whether they're getting the right triage, the right assessment right today for the hundreds of Britons who have either come back from the arena of Syria and Iraq or are still out there. And this is really worrying. They're not going to get it right every time. It's not perfect science. So I think, there is a tacit admission in Whitehall. This guy slipped through the net. They got it wrong. But, they're going to try, I suppose, that much harder to make sure they don't make the same mistakes with others.
All right, Frank, thank you. Well, let's talk as well, as I said, to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. And Norman, it's a very strongly worded statement from Tony Blair, isn't it, about this?
You really sense there is a hunt on now for a political scalp, for someone to be blamed for the government campaigning for the release of this man, then in being paid £1 million, then in being allowed to escape to Syria. And the Daily Mail, in its coverage, clearly apportions much of that blame on Tony Blair, suggesting in one headline, "Still think he wasn't a danger, Mr. Blair," a taunt which has prompted a furious response. In a statement, Mr. Blair says he only argued for the release of these men after pressure from lawyers, from MPs, the media, and yes, the Daily Mail, who he says noted after their release, they're not bad guys, they are entirely innocent. Mr. Blair also says it wasn't him who sanctioned the payment of £1 million in compensation. That was the Cameron government. And he says it was Tory MPs who were pressing for the men to be released quickly when he was concerned about the safety implications. What is going on? In part, it's simply Mr. Blair trying to set the record straight as he sees it. But in part two, it's personal. It's payback, you sense, for years of goading and taunting of the new Labour government and Tony Blair and Iraq. But I think also it's Brexit. Newspapers like the Daily Mail have been at the centre of the pro-Brexit campaign, and Mr. Blair just the other day called for Remainers to stand their ground, to make the case against the referendum. And you sense Mr. Blair is trying to give a lead. Indeed, the former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg said many Remainers were frightened of papers like the Daily Mail, and that's why they were silent. Mr. Blair, it seems, is trying to put a bit of backbone into them.
Norman, thank you. Norman Smith. A new BBC television channel for Scotland has been announced by the corporation's Director General Tony Hall. The channel will begin broadcasting in the autumn of 2018 and will have a budget of £30 million, equivalent to the amount spent on BBC 4. The plans for the channel include a Scottish news hour at 9 o'clock in the evening with stories from Scotland, the UK and around the world. Our Scotland correspondent, Lorna Gordon, reports.
Inform, educate and entertain. The BBC's mission. Increased devolution has provided challenges for the national broadcaster.
2.5 minutes to an hour.
Now, a new channel and a new news programme for Scotland.
I think Scotland deserves its own channel that reflects itself, its creativity, its culture, as well as its politics. And I wanted to move the game on. And in the end, my aim through all of this has been to think about the viewers in Scotland and what is best for them. And I think they want quality and they want choice.
Tonight on Timeline...
The new channel will broadcast shows like this one, currently shown on BBC Two in Scotland. But with a budget of £30 million a year, much of the 5 hours of programmes on offer every night will be new. There'll also be an integrated news hour at 9, with national and international news.
It's a huge opportunity for Scotland to assert itself to itself and more broadly across the UK, and for it to reflect on some of the other things beyond politics. I mean, Scotland has a really, really vibrant arts community, creative community, whatever, and I think there's a real opportunity now for those communities to be better reflected.
Most high profile, though, has been the debate around news. The BBC said the 6 o'clock news had performed strongly in Scotland in recent years, but some have long argued for a Scottish version. They say to better reflect devolved areas like health, education and criminal justice.
Obviously, I welcome new jobs and new investment in BBC Scotland. I am, however, disappointed that the BBC has decided not to go ahead with the separate Scottish 6 on BBC One, because I think that this is exactly the time for the launch of that new programme with all the political developments we know.
This change to the broadcasting landscape in Scotland is being described as the biggest single investment in broadcast content here for more than 20 years. Challenging, yes, but bold and ambitious too, and on air in a year and a half's time. Lorna Gordon, BBC News, Glasgow.
A convicted murderer is on the run after armed men helped him escape during a hospital visit. Sean Walmsley is one of 4 men serving a life sentence for a fatal stabbing in Liverpool in 2014. Walmsley fled as he was getting into a car with prison officers outside Aintree University Hospital. Our correspondent Fiona Trott is at the hospital now. Fiona.
Jane, Sean Walmsley was here for an appointment, and when he was coming out, the prison officers accompanying him were threatened by masked men. One of them put a gun to their head, another one had a knife at his neck. All they had to defend themselves was a baton, we've been told, and that's raising questions here this afternoon. Was there enough security for this hospital visit? And how do people on the outside know exactly where this prisoner was? Wanted by police, Sean Walmsley is described as highly dangerous, a murderer who should not be approached. The police hunt has brought officers here, the Walton area of Liverpool. A house and a car were searched late last night, less than 2 miles from where he escaped. It happened at the Aintree University Hospital yesterday afternoon. Walmsley had an appointment. As he left, masked men threatened the prison staff with what's believed to have been a gun and a knife. Today, Merseyside police are appealing for the public's help to find the prisoner.
There will be lots of people who will have been in the vicinity at the time. I'm really appealing to them to come forward. I need the public's help to get Walmsley back into prison. He deserves to be behind bars. He's a highly dangerous, vicious individual. He has to be behind bars. We will not rest until he is.
This is why Sean Walmsley is well known on Merseyside. Back in 2014, he murdered a local man, Anthony Duffy, in what police described as a frenzied attack. He was jailed for life and is serving a minimum term of 30 years in prison. So was there enough security surrounding this man at hospital? And how do people on the outside know exactly where he was? These questions will form part of the Police and Ministry of Justice investigation. Now, police say the gold Volvo, which they believe was used as the getaway car, has now been found. Forensics teams are examining that at the moment. Police are also looking at CCTV pictures from the hospital grounds to see if that will help them find this escaped prisoner. Jane.
Fiona, thank you. Fiona Trott. The time now is 19 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. The fiancé of the children's author Helen Bailey has been found guilty of her murder. Coming up on the programme, Fit for a Princess, some of Diana's most famous dresses are going on public display.
And later in South today, major disruption again in Portsmouth as another unexploded wartime bomb is dredged up from the harbour. And parents' anger. Their preschool is forced to close in Berkshire after being evicted by the local church.
Nearly a quarter of high street shops don't have wheelchair access, and only 1 in 10 offers equipment for people who use a hearing aid. That's according to a new survey by the not-for-profit organisation Disabled Go. As part of the BBC's Disability Works Week, our correspondent Nikki Fox has been looking at how the fashion industry targets disabled customers who have a collective spending power of £249 billion, which is known as the Purple Pound.
The changing face of the British High Street has for many disabled people not changed fast enough. And this lack of visible disability has spurred on one woman to try and do something about it. This shop in London is swapping its regular mannequin for the Maniqual. Sophie Morgan designed this wheelchair for a sitting mannequin, a business she started back in 2010.
And here it is!
During the 2012 London Paralympics, Sophie got her product into a big high street store. But as soon as the games finished, her Maniqual was taken out and was never used again.
I haven't seen it in a shop window in about 5 years.
Now she feels it's the right time to give it another go.
Young men and women going out shopping don't feel welcome and do not feel like they are part of the conversation when it comes to style and fashion. I wanted this chair to be a symbol of inclusion from the shop, so that I could come past this shop and I know that this shop will have thought about how to style somebody in a wheelchair, but furthermore that their shop is accessible and that they've got changing rooms that are accessible. And can you see in that shop front window there, did you notice it was a wheelchair?
I hadn't noticed.
No. What do you make of it?
Absolutely great, why not? You know. Fashion is for everybody.
People are becoming more like socially aware as well now, so like yeah, I think it'll be absolutely fine.
It's not just about seeing disability on the high street, it's about accessibility as well. Making sure disabled people can actually get into shops so that they can spend their hard-earned cash.
Exclusive figures reveal of the nearly 1,300 fashion retailers the organisation Disabled Go visited, 23% had no step-free access. 90% were unable to offer hearing loops, a type of sound system for hearing aid users, and 62% didn't give their staff training on how best to support disabled customers. So from the high street to high-end fashion, designers Tetum Jones used 2 disabled models to launch their newest collection, which opened London Fashion Week on Friday.
We haven't adapted anything in this collection. We approach the styling and the casting of this collection as we would any other collection.
The Minister for Disabled People, Penny Mordaunt, wants businesses to be open to everyone. But the British Retail Consortium point out shop owners can be restricted on making adjustments due to the age or design of a building.
The Purple Pound exists, that we are there, we want to spend money, and it's time to bring us in.
Nikki Fox, BBC News.
Malaysian police say they want to question a North Korean diplomat about the killing at Kuala Lumpur airport of Kim Jong-nam, the estranged half-brother of the country's leader. 2 other suspects have been identified, including a man employed by the North's state airline. Malaysia's police chief also revealed that there'd been an attempted break-in at the mortuary where Kim Jong-nam's body is being held. Just to tell you, there is flash photography in this report from our correspondent Paul Adams.
The mystery surrounding the death of Kim Jong-nam deepens by the day. Around him, a whole constellation of suspects and a growing conviction that this was the work of North Korea.
This is the Air Korea stuff.
The Malaysian police have added 2 new North Koreans to the wanted list, an employee of the state airline and a senior embassy official. And they say they now know exactly how the attack was carried out.
You know, what actually happened was, these 2 ladies were trained to swap deceased face. Before that, the 4 suspects will give them the liquid. Will put the liquid on their hands. They are supposed to wipe it over deceased face.
What was the substance smeared on Mr. Kim's face? The police still don't know, but say surveillance footage shows the women keeping their hands away from their bodies and heading straight for the washrooms. A further twist, Malaysian special forces guarding the mortuary where Mr. Kim's body is being kept. The police say there have been attempts to break in. North Korea has denied any involvement. On Monday, the ambassador in Kuala Lumpur said the investigation couldn't be trusted. It drew a measured but distinct rebuke from Malaysia's Prime Minister.
We have good relations with North Korea all this while. The statement by the ambassador was totally uncalled for. It is considered diplomatically rude on his part.
The death of Kim Jong-nam is testing relations between two normally friendly countries. The Malaysian authorities have asked to interview the new suspects and have warned the North Korean embassy that they expect cooperation. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Footage has been released of the near miss involving the plane being flown by Harrison Ford in California. It emerged last week that the actor landed his single-engine plane on a taxiway instead of the runway at John Wayne Airport. He narrowly missed an airliner with 110 people on board. It's predicted that South Korean women will be the first in the world to have an average life expectancy above 90. And here in the UK, men and women are expected to live well into their 80s for the first time. Research carried out by Imperial College London in collaboration with the World Health Organization shows that in many countries people are living longer and the gap between the sexes is closing. Aisling McVeigh reports.
We all know we're living longer, but by just how much? Apart from a blip in 2011 and 2012, life expectancy in the UK has gradually been rising. From birth, the average life expectancy for a woman is currently just over 83 years. For a man, it's 79. But according to experts, the gender gap could be closing. By 2030, it's being predicted women's life expectancy will be over 85, with men's rising to 82.5. Compare that to South Korea, though, where the average lifespan could break the 90-year barrier.
Countries that have done better are countries that have actually done that have managed to deal with things again, from childhood to adulthood through old age really well. So South Korea, a country that is doing remarkably well, they have some of the lowest levels of hypertension and obesity in the world. They have had some of the best investments in childhood nutrition.
I do most of the things I did as a young woman. I still do the accounts for the firm I used to work for, and I think it's all in your head.
You've got to stop thinking that you're so old.
Just bought myself a bike. I mean, in my youth, I've cycled all over the country, you know. But I've got my L plates on again. I'm getting fitter.
Scientists once thought an average life expectancy of over 90 was impossible. But with research now suggesting there may be no upper limit, there's more pressure for investment in health and social care to cope with our ageing population. Aisling McVeigh, BBC News.
Princess Diana was a style icon, and now many of her dresses are about to go on display to the public. Some of her most recognisable and exquisite outfits have been brought together for a new exhibition, Diana, Her Fashion Story, in this, the 20th anniversary year of her death. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell has been to Kensington Palace for a preview.
Her public image was in so many ways defined by the clothes that she wore. She was one of the world's most photographed women, and many of the world's top designers clamoured to dress her. The results were frequently eye-catching, dresses that have lingered in the memory. And now, 20 years after Diana's death, 25 of those dresses have been brought together for an exhibition at her former home, Kensington Palace. They chart the evolution of an initially quite demure teenager through to her emergence on the national and international stages, with, outwardly at least, much greater confidence in her choices of costume. So here are some of the famous dresses, the one that she wore to dance with John Travolta, and others that were part of her wardrobe in the 1990s.
By the time she's wearing this dress, she's very confident in her own sense of style. We're seeing a Diana who has risen above those seasonal changes in fashion, and she has a timeless elegance. She knows what suits her and she wears it well.
Few would disagree with that, and the exhibition organisers can be confident that the crowds will come from around the world to experience something of Diana's glamour. Interest in Diana remains considerable despite the passage of years, but one imagines that her family would hope that she will be remembered for much more than just the dresses she wore. So do the organisers feel comfortable about perpetuating the focus on Diana and her clothes?
I think that's a very good question, because Diana herself didn't like to be known as a clothes horse. However, she did understand the language of fashion very well, and she used clothes to help her do the job at hand. She was a very proud ambassadress for British fashion as Princess of Wales, but she also used clothes to help her do her job as a humanitarian and as a patron of the arts, and to focus the press attention on her charity work.
They were the essential props which helped this sometimes insecure young woman to face the world and win its admiration for her image of glamour and style. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at Kensington Palace.
Now let's catch up with the weather prospects, if we dare. John Hammond has joined me. Hello.
Hi there, Jane. Wild and wintry spell for all of us, disruptive for some, damaging for a few, I have to say. And whilst Doris will never be the storm of the century, it will certainly pack a punch as it develops explosively over the next few hours and arrives on our doorstep by tomorrow morning. Mind you, it's not exactly pleasant out there at the moment across parts of Western England and Wales. It's raining hard here, mild across the southern half of the UK. Chillier further north. Here the best of the brightness, the worst of the gales for the time being clearing away from the far northeast of Scotland. But then all eyes to the west as we head into the night. It'll soon turn very wet across Northern Ireland. A lot of rain across northern areas, over an inch of rain in some places. That will have its own impacts. And on the northern edge of Doris as it arrives, as the rain hits the cold air, it will turn to snow. Let's break the weather down into the various elements. First of all, snow. An amber warning in force from the Met Office. And now, as ever with snowfall, the worst of the conditions will be up over the high ground, but it won't just be up over the high ground, we think, because through the central belt we could see a few centimetres of snow, Glasgow, Edinburgh area, and certainly over the southern uplands, the Cheviots, for example, a lot more than that. This could well be the scene, particularly in upland areas, wet, sticky snow tomorrow morning for your rush hour. Now, that area of snow just edging a little bit further southwards. For the rest of it, it's just a thoroughly nasty morning. Areas of wind and rain spiralling around Doris. There will be some brightness in between. But let's focus on the next element of severe weather, and that is the wind. Again, an amber warning in force from the Met Office for the wind. It will be disruptive and, for some of us, quite damaging, particularly, we think, in a zone coming in off the Irish Sea late morning into parts of northwest England, Wales, through the Midlands, across other northern counties and into eastern England. 60 or 70 mile an hour gusts inland, 80, possibly 90 mile an hour gusts around coastal areas. What does that mean? Well, yeah, these sorts of scenes. Trees over, there could well be some vehicles upturned, certainly some fence panels down in one or two places, and for a few of us, something rather more serious than that. Now, the exact area of the worst of the winds still a little bit open to doubt, but certainly a sting in the tail along the east coast late on in the afternoon before things eventually subside and cold air sweeps its way southwards as we end the day. Doris doesn't hang around. It does clear off during the course of tomorrow evening. Some wintry showers following on behind in the cold air. And there's something of a lull as we head into Friday, briefly, because although there will be some sunshine across the southern and eastern parts of the UK, more rain arrives across the north and the west, and with the air turning milder, a rapid snow melt, and that rain continuing into Saturday, that brings the risk of flooding across parts of Scotland. All the latest on the warnings as ever can be found on the BBC weather website. Okay.
John, thank you. John Hammond. And just a reminder of our main story here this lunchtime. The fiancé of the children's author Helen Bailey has been found guilty of her murder. That is all from the BBC News at 1. It's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we join the BBC's news teams wherever you are. Enjoy your afternoon. Bye-bye.